his own work has focused much more on the question of colour, as to some extent of his writings. So it's extremely good to have someone on colour at the AA, where, to paraphrase Henry Ford, you can have any colour you want as long as it's white. So he's going to lecture this evening on perception of colour, and I suppose probably will show us some of the work from the exhibition that he had recently, Polymonochromes, which was held at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, and Monochromobiles, which was the display earlier this year at the Economist gallery. In addition to his own artwork, he's a frequent contributor to ArtScribe, to Frieze and Art Forum, and his most recent book, Minimalism, was published by the Tate this year. David.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. As I was the title of the talk was going to be Chromaphobia and How to Recognize It. For a number of years I've tried to both write about contemporary art in some form or another and to make it in some form or another. And for most of the last 10 or 12 years, those two activities have been relatively separate from one another. Much more recently, the desk work and the studio work have kind of converged, which has been rather interesting for me and rather unexpected in many ways as well. And they've converged around one particular area, which I could is the area of colour. I would stress that the colour occurred first in the studio to me. It was not remotely a theoretical interest, nor yet, to begin with, was it a practical interest at all. Actually, can I put the two slides on so you can look at them instead of me? These are slides of recent work, in particular the Monochromobiles, which were shown at the Economist Building. So they're both from the most recent stuff I've done from last year. I will talk about them in a bit, as to quite why they occur like they do. The interesting colour certainly first occurred in the studio, and it also largely occurred by accident. It was never something I particularly intended ever to concentrate on in any way whatsoever. And I will discuss, I'll go on a bit later to characterise how it came about and how I've been trying to figure it out in the studio. But it's somewhat easier to talk about the desk work, if you like, the writing I'm doing around colour. It would also serve somehow to frame the kind of interests that are going into the studio. It won't take very long, I hope. At the moment, the desk work is taking the form of a book I'm trying to write, which I've given the name Chromaphobia, and the title Chromaphobia. I haven't written much more than the title of it so far, so it's fairly speculative. But yeah, get the title first, and then the rest follows. Chromaphobia is a word I've made up for myself. Its definition is the fear of corruption through colour. And it's come to... I mean, I originally wrote it as an essay for the show I did at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds. And it actually started off as more or less as a joke, which then turned into an essay. Now the essay is turning into a book, so it's the book of the joke, of the essay of the joke. However, I'm entirely serious about it. I take chromophobia, the fear of corruption through colour, to be endemic in high culture in the West, of which I take the Architectural Association to be a particular instance. It seems in high culture in the West, I specifically mean high culture and I specifically mean the West, rather than culture generally or in any other way. It seems that seriousness is an entirely black and white issue, and that meaningfulness only seems to come in shades of grey. Nearly all art which has makes claims to seriousness or profundity tends towards tonality and tends away from colour. That would be a very broad generalisation that I'd make. Although quite early on I'd want to distinguish between the relationship between art and colour on the one hand, and the relationship between criticism and colour on the other. It's often in theory and in criticism that colour, the true chromophobic prejudices come out. And I will give you a couple of quick examples. They happen my favourite ones, and they're quite entertaining. This is a quote from Charles White, who was a critic and French Minister of Culture in the late 1900s. Who wrote, "The union of design and colour is necessary to beget painting, just as is the union of man and woman to beget mankind." You know what's coming next. "But design must maintain its preponderance over colour. Otherwise painting speeds to its ruin. It will fall through colour, just as mankind fell through Eve." You know, the quicker the sharper people in the audience, people who've been to Marx talks, will detect a certain sexism in that particular commentary. Here's another one, slightly more recent. "Minimalism is something you arrive at, a development of the sensitivity of the brain. Civilization started with ornamentation. Look at all that bright colour. The minimal sensibility may not be the peak of civilization, but it is at a high point between the earth and the sky." Anyone know who said that? It was Claudio Silvestrin, who at least some of the audience ought to know as an architect or interior designer at least. The sort of mystic Meg of minimalism, featured on a TV program the other day as well. And it seems to me that what Silvestrin's doing is, and this was from an article I read in The Guardian a matter of a few months ago. And it seems to me that in Silvestrin's rhetoric, there's a clear chromophobic prejudice. And actually a rather old-fashioned one as well. It's one that seems to me to come almost directly from someone like Adolf Loos and not to be much modified since that point. Admittedly, it seems to me a remarkable thing to say. However, I just use those as just very brief examples to give an indication of the chromophobic prejudices which surround us and maybe even inhabit us. In very general terms, I think the more I've read and looked around about the subject, that colour in the West and Western high culture is positioned as other, to use a very fashionable phrase. Other in the sense that it is habitually seen as either feminine, primitive, as in the examples I've just given, oriental, infantile, vulgar, or queer. Or alternatively, it is seen as merely supplementary, inessential, decorative, or cosmetic. Cosmetics, one of the main phrases which is used as a characterization of the relationship between colour and form. And cosmetic, on the one hand, makes it seem either feminine in its conventional associations, or perhaps queer. And it also, the cosmetic doesn't just decorate a surface. In the way it's often talked about, it can often mask what is the true form of something and seduce the viewer into thinking it's something else. It's seen not as just a mere addition, but somehow a corruption of what's underneath it. So it's not just inessential, it's actually harmful. And that's often the way in which colour is represented. I could give many, many examples, and I won't. It's a funny kind of other, though. It's a funny other colour. Because most things which are treated as other are usually positioned either physically or geographically, as it were, away from us. It is, the Oriental, or depending on your gender, the feminine. It's over there, away from our good, clean, pure selves. The curious thing about colour is that it's absolutely everywhere. And there's no meaningful sense in which one can separate oneself from it or banish it. Colour is probably the one thing that inhabits not only our every waking moment, but also our sleeping moments, in that, at least in some people, one dreams in colour. It's an other which is somehow completely all around us, whenever and wherever we are, which then makes me think about things like Claudio Silvestri's interiors. They're almost like kind of Raj fortresses. They're to maintain the kind of bastion of coherence and rational existence in amongst the natives, but somehow kept away from them. Anyway, the question, of course, which really arises is why is colour so treated so negatively, with such prejudice? And a suggestion which has been made by a number of writers. I mean, and a few writers in the 20th century have written about colour in incredibly interesting ways, but they're usually fairly fragmentary comments. For Wittgenstein, it was really that colour was, I think it's because, this is not his phrase so much as mine, which is the problem with colour is that it's very fluid. It's not a fluid, although it's often made into fluids, but it's fluid in the sense that it's highly resistant to conceptualization. In that sense, it's highly resistant to language. And then maybe that's the great threat of colour, is that it reminds us of the limits of language. But however, this is the kind of stuff I'm trying to write about in Chromaphobia. Of the people who have written interestingly about colour, they tend not to have tried to rescue it from its being positioned as feminine or queer or oriental or infantile or so forth, but so much to celebrate that very characteristic of it. There's an extremely interesting, very odd essay by Kristeva, Giotto's Joy, where she tries to discuss the blueness of the blue that Giotto uses. And she takes that straight back to the imaginary, to the pre-symbolic, to that moment, as it were, before the entry into language. There's some very early comments by Walter Benjamin on colour. And he takes colour straight back to childhood. It's a condition of childhood. Derek Jarman's wonderful book, Chroma, one of the best books on colour that's been published recently. He makes a strong connection, not an overwhelming one, but just various points. He makes this connection between colour and sexuality. Others, who else? Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, lots of other stuff on colour. It's extraordinarily strange and rich area, I think. So, I obviously think I wouldn't be talking about it. Now, if the stuff I'm doing in the writing is about, if you like, chromophobia, the prejudices against colour, I guess the simple way of saying it would be that the work I'm doing in the studio is, if you like, the campaign against chromophobia. I mean, that's sort of too pat and too simple and too clear. Partly because it's very easy to talk in theoretical terms about questions of colour. In practical terms, colour is never separate from materials, surfaces, questions of light, and the contingencies of everyday existence. And as I suggested at the beginning, the colour cropped up for me in the studio almost entirely by accident. Was when something was going seriously wrong somewhere down the line, and in a sort of fit of desperation, I tried painting it a bright colour, and gradually after that point, colour seemed to become more and more. I couldn't quite put it away again once I'd summoned it up, if you like. I can't talk about the work I make purely in terms of colour, though. It's just simply not that easy. And I find it far less easy to talk in general about what I make in the studio than what I'm trying to write about, for some fairly straightforward reasons, I think. And I've been trying to think of ways to describe it coherently as I can. What I'd have to say is there's probably 2 or 3 broad areas which have kind of preoccupied me for quite a long time. And I could list them quite simply as the area between painting and sculpture, an area which was obviously defined in the early 1960s by people like Judd and others, and a wide range of other artists. Stuff which sort of somehow derives from painting, but isn't quite painting, and yet isn't quite sculpture either. What Judd called three-dimensional work. That seems to have been a preoccupation for some time. Another broad area would be if you like, what I would, I guess, call the residue of abstraction, of abstract art. I mean, abstract art seems the most sort of bizarrely sort of unfashionable thing to talk about these days. It seems to have been pretty much thrown out with the, if you like, with the bathwater of modernism. The third area, which certainly interests me, is the idea of the question of the monochrome, as I guess is the kind of high point of, or one of the kind of high points of 20th century abstract art, or one of the key points of it, if not the high points of it. Having said that these areas between painting and sculpture, abstraction and the monochrome are preoccupations of mine, it makes me a bit nervous because I think all those areas are identified with a kind of, or beset even by a kind of rhetoric of purity, if you like, by a kind of aloofness, a kind of preciousness or hypersensitivity. And I think part of the job is to somehow try to rescue what's left of abstraction, what the monochrome might have been from what's become a rather kind of precious and I don't know, yeah, aloof kind of talk and kind of experience. Certainly, one of the aims is to try to put some intensity and some colour, some intensity and some pleasure back into the question of colour, and to put some colour and some of the absurdity back into the monochrome, and then in turn to put the monochrome and abstraction back into something more like a kind of everyday experience of the city. In a huge amount of writing about abstract art and the monochrome, it's seen as being something that if you do monochromes or if you do kind of abstraction, somehow you're defining yourself against or away from, if you like, everyday experience. I don't see why there's any reason why that should be the case. I think it often has become the case, but I don't think there's any reason why it need be. I wrote a press release for the Monochromobile exhibition I did at the Economist Building. And I said something along the lines of that the monochrome had a very strange history, going from kind of a revolutionary event in the hands of someone like Rodchenko and the Russian constructivists to becoming a kind of corporate decoration in the hands of more recent artists. And that it's a very odd passage it's trodden between the revolutionary events of the 1920s and the more corporate events of the 1980s and 1990s. Now, what I don't think is possible is to somehow to get hold of the monochrome and take it back to those revolutionary moments, to make it revolutionary again. That seems nostalgic and just unlikely. So what I said in the press release is that on the one hand it's been a revolutionary event, on the other hand it's been corporate decoration, but nobody had really thought of it properly as a form of transport. And not that I really think that the monochrome needs to be a form of transport, I'm just trying to imagine a way in which it might be somehow completely disconnected from that lineage that's so often described. Hence the Monochromobiles. Now, the only way I can really talk about how I came to make these things, is to quite straightforwardly to narrate the kind of course of events in the studio over the last 3 or 4 years. I think I'm not literally capable of just saying what they're about in any more straightforward way. So I will do just that, and at least you'll see some different pictures. I was once a chromaphobe. I confess. My name is David, and I was a chromaphobe. This is, after all, the AA, so it's appropriate to confess things like that. I have no intention of talking about these works in any detail, except to say that they are kind of, oddly enough, the starting point for what I've ended up making more recently. And they were really thought of, in a way, I suppose they're more kind of conceptual works than I've made subsequently. Incidentally, I also think that conceptual art has a huge amount of blame to take for the continuation of the chromophobic prejudices that exist. These were very simply works where I thought, well, okay, since Marcel Duchamp, anything you stick in a frame can be art. That's in a way, what the ready-made says. If you stick it in a museum, then it's art. It's entirely the contingent space that it occupies which makes it art, rather than some essential constituent of the work. And I thought, well, why not just make the frame into the art then, rather than collapse that kind of separation? And then the question arose, well, how can you make the frame itself in any way interesting as art, rather than having a kind of theatrically empty frame? And I sort of fiddled around trying to think of ways of manipulating the frame so as to make it somehow into the composition rather than a surround of it. And so they're very simple. They are literally picture frames which are notched or stretched or multiplied or made into squares or whatever. I then began to think that what I wanted to do was somehow extend that, and rather than just think of things as frames, as a frame, to think of instead the idea of framing, as to turn it into a verb, and to try to set up some kind of work whereby how the viewer framed it would determine what they saw, rather than it just being a frame. And that's wrong. Sorry, wrong button. I was invited to be in a summer show in well, you'll see Victoria Miro Gallery in 1992, and I had this superb idea, which I didn't mention to Victoria Miro at the time, which is that I'd make these socking great 8-foot-high frames. It's exactly the same system as the ones which hung in the walls, but they'd be freestanding. And so that from the front you'd get the frame, the thing, the shiny, the glossy, the reflective glass, the brilliant white, and so forth. And that's from the outside of the gallery, of course, from the street. And because Victoria Miro Gallery has a door halfway down the side, when you come into the gallery, the idea was you get... Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Can't do it. Sorry, I'm getting extremely confused here. Okay. No. That's it, okay. I'm there. So, that's it. Just ruined my next... giving the game away. The idea is, of the front you'd get all the information, and then all the good information, if you like, and from the back you'd just get a sort of prop and a dull lump of wood. I thought this was, dead radical and extremely interesting. Victoria Miro actually never spoke to me again. She certainly never sold them. I mean, they would be absolutely unsaleable in any way. I don't think they were very successful either. I think that, I maintained that the idea remained interesting. The realization was off the mark a bit at the time. I think I was trying to invest into one idea, i.e. the frame device, another kind of set of ideas, which didn't actually really go with it very well. However, that relationship between making a work which would have two kind of radically discontinuous elements to it, the polished, shiny, pristine bit, and the sort of crap, boring, functional bit, did stay with me for a long time as a kind of keen interest. And I think and then it became a question of figuring out how actually to do that. Yeah, so what am I doing? One of the things I realized, I thought that what I needed was that the front of it be absolutely flat and without divisions and singular and sort of intense, And I thought, well, so I got a lump of Perspex, very small lump of Perspex, only about that big, it's a little maquette. And I thought, well, you can't now just have it as, it's got to, you can't just have it as a bit of Perspex, it's got to be opaque so as you can't see the back. So I better paint it. That's how the colour occurred. It's simply as sort of desperate and as contingent as that. So I got a bit of Perspex and I painted the back of it this kind of magenta colour. And then, you've already seen it now, damn it. Right. And the back of it was my little sort of homage to Picasso, a bit of found object, a bit of crap from from the studio floor or something. And then, in a way, this was just a sort of maquette version of the larger thing, but trying to sort of work it out in a rather different form. And I guess what it also brought together more particularly was the idea of the monochrome and the ready-made being somehow, or the monochrome and the found object being kind of colliding together in a completely unresolved way. And that sort of lack of resolution I found rather attractive. And particularly when most sculpture, most three-dimensional work, almost from whatever time, is fairly homogeneous in the sense that whatever angle you approach it from, you get relatively similar form of information, be it a Tony Cragg or Henry Moore or whatever. That you come out from one angle and it'll be marble and it'll be curvy, and you go from another angle and it'll be marble and curvy, or whatever. And it still did interest me, this idea that approaching it from one side will produce an entirely different kind of information from the other side. And I guess what I was looking at the time, quite consciously, were things like... Oh. Yeah. No, wrong. They're screws, but I got rid of them. That was one of the big problems with these. Is they really needed to be completely clean of any connecting points or any visible connection with the back of them, and even the screws just holding the whole thing together. And this was the first one I made. Give me a chance. No, fine. Who was that? See you later. In a way, that actually became the biggest concern for ages, was how to get rid of the bloody screws, so that nothing remained visible. And you get into all sorts of nonsense about various glues and so forth. And basically, you end up making very, very strange chemical sandwiches, basically with Perspex at the front, paint on that, silicone on the paint, and whatever it is against that. So these sort of four-way sandwiches, and you can never assume that these various chemicals are going to behave properly when they get in touch with one another. But that's one of the sort of very basic problems of making anything these days. And what I was quite consciously trying to do was somehow, if you like, to reproduce the experience that one gets just knocking around town. Particularly things like billboards, where from the front you get all the information. It's look at me, look at me, look at me. It's flashy, it's bright. Well, not particularly in this case, but it'll do. And from the back, it's just whatever lumps of steel you have to hold it in place. It's sort of the entirely functional and the not to be looked at, or the to be not looked at in a funny kind of way. And that has always intrigued me, that kind of, the idea of a kind of facade culture, which I think we live in quite obviously in a way. I don't mean that sort of morally. I think we literally inhabit a world of facades where surfaces and structures are entirely independent of one another. You can hang any face, any facade off a steel frame construction, obviously. So that's what I'm trying to at least hint at suggesting, is that how these works might have some sort of interest in the experience of the modern city, as well as in interest in questions of art, the monochrome and the ready-made and such like. I then sort of figured, well, big problem with this thing is about a foot high. Okay, I thought, well, I've got to make them bigger, because you have to. You have to make art big. Well, at least I thought you had to. The problem is, if you're trying to make one of these 4 foot high, it's very hard to find a thrown-away double base, with which to scale it up. And you find you just stick your head in skips all the time, and you don't come up with it starts getting fussy, and it needs to be fairly careless looking in the back. You can't concentrate on it too much. but those sort of attractive bits of fragments of found objects just don't occur on a larger scale. Well, they certainly didn't for me. And I tried all sorts of things. I tried doors, and I tried all sorts of nonsense. It didn't work. I had to go back into the skip. What I did realize quite quickly was that you could use steel. And then if you start using flat panels of steel, and the first one I made in steel was simply one flat panel of steel, Perspex, painted Perspex in the front of it, and a kind of leg or foot that it stood on. I then realized quite quickly that you could start bolting the steel together, and you could maintain something of the kind of consistency of the flat, shiny, polished, monochromatic surface, and then the crude, very straightforward, practical back. It also enabled the use of steel rather than found wood enables you to scale them up and down much more easily, and they're much more rigid and much easier to work with. So that then led me on to produce a whole number of works on that principle, which I called Polymonochromes, because each panel is a monochromatic panel, and it's separated from every other panel by the 10 mil Perspex and the 10 mil steel. So there's a physical separation of each panel from the other. So they are, I think in a way they retain their characteristic as monochrome panels, but because they're up to 9 bolted together or more in some of them, then they're sort of multicolored monochromes, which is clearly an intended contradiction in terms. I have to say I quite like inventing names for the work. Because it's like suggesting that the language in our culture is not rich enough to describe what you've just made. It's kind of a nice idea. I don't think it's true, of course, but it's a nice idea. And I tried to continue with these, what I was doing with the Victoria Miro Gallery, to have them all facing one way, to have a kind of forest of overlapping colour sections, so that as well as having the actual individual pieces of work, that as you moved around the space, you'd get other colour combinations would occur depending on where your eye line was in relationship to the other kinds of other pieces. I also continued in the sense that from the front of the gallery, you would get, as it were, all the information, all the good bits, all the brightness and all the colour. And then when you walked into the gallery, which conveniently for me, the door was also in a very similar position as it is in the Victoria Miro Gallery. The door was halfway down the gallery space, so as you walked in, you came in and, as it were, just got the lumps of steel. I kind of hoped you'd feel kind of cheated in a way. It actually, of course, didn't quite work like that, because you carry with you the information and so on. Nevertheless, I still was kind of intrigued with that kind of relationship. As for the colour combinations themselves, I wanted them to be as provisional, as unconnected with anything like colour theory or colour circles or the conventional geometries of colour which are established as possible. And so at the same time I wanted them to be interesting. So I didn't want them to be random. Let's go back to those. So you're in a kind of slightly odd space between trying to avoid any kind of systematic or conventional combinations of colour, at the same time not wanting to go into that area of just sort of complete randomness. And what I ended up doing was just try out various swatches of colour together. And if you see a pattern arising, like dark light, or primary, secondary, then to scrap it. And then to keep going until there was no pattern, but at the same time it looked relatively interesting. And I hoped that would keep the whole thing looking very provisional and very light and very uncertain. However, I also became increasingly troubled by the fact that using fairly strong geometric type shapes, verticals and horizontals, squares, crosses and such like, that however provisional and unlikely the colour combinations were, there was something very rigid about the structure of these things, and they remained rather fixed and static, even though they were bolted together and they could be rebolted in other configurations. It also struck me as like doing a bit of drawing and then colouring it in, rather than letting the colour determine the characteristic of the work. And that was really beginning to bother me. It was like somehow colour was still secondary to the drawing stage, there was still a kind of disegno versus colore opposition in the work, however bright the colour was. And that was certainly bothering me. Then what happened? This was in 1995 at Curtin Road in EC2, I may or may not have mentioned. The colours themselves come from the Dulux colour chart, which is the richest source of colour you can find. One of the great things about the colour chart, as opposed to the traditional colour circle, is that it's completely devoid of any grammar or any hierarchies of colour. If you go into an art shop, you go to buy your Winsor & Newtons or whatever, I think as you go in, you carry in with you that baggage of what you were taught at school about colour. That there are primaries and there are secondaries and there are tertiaries. There are pure colours and there are impure colours. And I think that's unavoidable when you're using particularly things like oil paints and the way in which they're laid out for you. The great advantage of the colour chart is you can just go and select any colour as a kind of ready-made. You don't have to think, oh, how is this mixed, or how do I make this out of these other colours? There are 2,000 colours, and in a way they're all equal. They are simply a list. And I think that really is a great advantage of the colour chart. It allows you to sort of suspend what you know and you cannot get rid of about colour and their relationships. So colour becomes a kind of ready-made in these things. Okay. Yeah, and there was that. Oh, yeah. And this is a kind of transitional one here. I began to prefer them when they were more and more closely clustered next to one another, rather than spread out. So you've got almost a kind of forest of elements which would kind of interweave and overlap and become relatively confusing. I think around the time I started making these, I read a review of Salman Rushdie's most recent novel, The Moor's Last Sigh, and the reviewer referred to Rushdie's writing as Carnivalesque, which I thought was an absolutely superb and incredibly accurate description of Rushdie's writing. Also an incredibly attractive term, the idea of the Carnivalesque, something of being... And I think, well, the Carnivalesque is, I think, in a common sense way, always associated with colour. Carnival, Carnivalesque, colourful. Also, I think, I then learned, of course, that it was not an innocent word at all, Carnivalesque. It goes all the way back to Bakhtin, via Kristeva, and it refers to various kind of ideas of the grotesque body and fluidity and so forth. And Bakhtin doesn't talk about colour at all, I learned to my dismay, but Kristeva does, and she makes a very strong connection between the Carnivalesque and colour. But I thought the idea of something, a kind of, a Carnivalesque thing would be rather wonderful. However, when I was making these numerous bigger and littler pieces, it was also, I was quite keen to break up the scale of them, to make very big ones and very little ones, and to sort of combine them all together, so you got this kind of shifting of scale. To make them kind of, I mean, basically I was brought up a minimalist, and it took me a long time to expunge that from my system. And one of the things I think I learned when I was at art school is that if you do one painting, say, which is 6 foot by 4 foot, then you should do another 5 or another 10, and then your exhibition would be 10 identical size, identical shape, and very minor variations on a theme. And I was certainly hooked into that system for ages, and it took me a long time to get rid of it. And this was part of the process of trying to expel it. What I also found that when I was making these, as ever in the studio, there's a certain amount of waste is produced, offcuts of Perspex. You paint up your panels, then you cut them up, and there's always bits left over. And the bits that are left over you always stack in the corner. And then you stack bits on top of the stacks. And then you're halfway through making something, and you glance over your shoulder. This happens all the time, I think probably to anyone who works in the studio. You glance over your shoulder, and you notice that which you're throwing away seems almost as interesting as that which you're trying to make. Or actually, possibly, rather more interesting than what you're trying to make. And it's an extremely confusing moment that your sense of what you're doing suddenly starts going awry. And that's really quite precisely what happened at this particular moment in the studio. I was chucking away the bits of coloured Perspex, sticking them against the wall, and then looking over my shoulder and thinking, that's sort of interesting there. And so I literally, very simply, picked up a lump without, as it were, arranging them, picked up a cluster of these lumps, little offcuts of Perspex, and stuck them on a shelf, and to see whether they could in any way make sense as works by themselves. And that, on the top of the one on my side, the multicoloured shelf with what I had 8 bits of Perspex on, was literally the thing I picked up from the corner of the studio and stuck on the shelf. And from the moment I did that, maybe not the moment, maybe I kind of went back to the studio a bit and looked at it and wondered and so forth. But pretty quickly, the throwaway bit seemed far more interesting than that which I'd been labouring over and spending money on for what seemed like ages. And it seemed more interesting because it seemed more relaxed, less tyrannised by kind of geometry, less fixed, and much more provisional. Provisional partly because they're simply laid against the shelf and they lean against the wall. They're not glued or bolted into place at all, so they could always be redone. So from that, beginning to put them on shelves, which I just called shelf-likes because I couldn't think of any other thing to call them. Someone said, well, those shelf-like things you make. And I thought, well, the only thing you know about something called shelf-like is that it isn't a shelf. You can't say anything else about it. Having made one, if you like, more or less accidental one, I then made the duplicate of it in one colour, just to see whether it would be more or less interesting to be made out of one colour rather than out of many colours. And I guess partly to my surprise, I found that the single colour one seemed more interesting than the multicoloured one. Partly because it was less easy to read where the various things started and finished. And then I continued to make these shelves. It's exactly the same principle. Bits of clear Perspex, painted on the back with gloss paint, and stacked on a shelf. Up to 10 or 12 bits on a single shelf. The one on the red one is in fact in a fluorescent paint. Again, I was trying to find a way of making the colour as intense as possible. And by intensifying the colour, pretty much begin to make the shape somehow less important, less significant in the work. That somehow it was the colour that was doing the work, and the shape was a byproduct of the colour. And the colour became almost like a kind of just physical lumps of colour, rather than the colour of something, or the colour applied to something or attached to something. And then, having made some single shelves, I realised you could get. The shelves are simply made of angle iron, very ordinary angle iron from a steel merchant, and of course they come in 6-metre lengths, and you can spend half a day cutting one up, unless you get someone else to. Because then it occurred, well, why bother to cut them up? Why not stick the whole thing up and join them up? Which I duly did for an exhibition in Norwich, the East exhibition last summer. And there was the opportunity to make a work on site rather than make as it were, a studio piece which you would then go and just stick on a wall. I'd quite like the idea, as in things like bookshelves, that they always look great when they're done wall to wall, where they fit into the coves, and then I always rather wanted to make one which would be floor to ceiling as well, where the whole wall would end to end and top to bottom be covered in shelves, and those shelves would be covered in these pockets of colour. I very quickly learned that would be prohibitively expensive. Perspex cost a fortune. So having sent this plan along where I'd cover this whole stairwell in Norwich, very big 6-metre square stairwell, having sent this plan along that I would cover the whole wall in end to end and top to bottom in shelves of colour, I was actually reduced to making one, and that still pretty much bankrupts me. But part of the idea, one of the reasons I was interested in doing something in a stairwell rather than just on any old wall was that you're always approaching it from an odd angle, and you're always walking past it. You don't go into the room, look at it, and then walk away. You're either going up at it or coming down from it. And in a group show, doing something in a stairwell means everyone has to see it twice rather than once as well. So you get 2 bites of the audience, if you like. I then was, shortly after this, asked if I'd do something at the Economist Building. I mean, I don't know how many of you know the Economist Building. It's designed by the Smithsons. Is it Bob and Roberta Smithson? It's a very exquisite building, but the interior is all marble, Travertine marble, as far as that's what I was told it was, at least. So when I rolled up with my proposal that I'd do these shelves, like do a very long shelf going all the way around the interior, the lift shaft bit, because it's all glass walls. They very quickly made it clear to me that their walls were far more precious than anything I might make and stick on them, and that my hammer drill was not going to be let anywhere near their panels of marble. So I suddenly couldn't do it, which was kind of slightly problematic. And well, then you just get put into this rather awkward position again. You think, well, so what am I going to do? You want to do the show because it's in London. It's interesting, very interesting space, odd, and a lot of light and good glass walls and so forth. And it's one of those things where you go back to the studio and you kind of look around and you begin to notice things in the studio which you'd slightly put to the back of your mind. And about 3 years ago, as I was wandering around King's Cross, where I live, I stress that's where I live. I just don't wander around there. I saw an old wooden. It's true. I saw an old wooden trolley, and I thought that would be handy, with metal wheels. That'd be dead handy. I realised I probably deprived someone of their living quarters. But I thought it'd be dead useful. A trolley's always useful in the studio when you're making three-dimensional things. Great, wheel things around. It'd be fantastic. It was absolutely hopeless. It was always like one of those Sainsbury trolleys where it always just never goes in the right direction. I just had this trolley lying around in the studio for about 3 years, doing nothing. But I never wanted to throw it away because it might come in useful. And for no apparent reason, and maybe I think I'd had half a mind that I'd like to make use of the trolley. I'd always liked sculptures on wheels, I think. I always think David Smith's sculptures on wheels are very funny. That however heavy the materials he's working with, however heavy the I-beams and the lumps of steel he's using, if you stick them on wheels, then you can't take it that seriously. It's sort of funny. They might get away. Apparently, I was told that David Smith's sculpture did get away once. That they didn't put the chocks under the wheels in a studio, maybe it was the Guggenheim, and it sort of rolled off and went straight through a wall. It was so bloody heavy. Well, anyway, and so I thought, well, okay, maybe I can. This is this rather precious building, a very beautiful building. Maybe I need something a bit sort of rough, and maybe I can make some use of the trolley. I'd also known that I'd wanted to do something on where these panels of colour were horizontal rather than vertical, or at 45 degrees or thereabouts, which they are on the shelves. If you've got a lot of light and the panels are horizontal, then the colour really comes out, and you get a lot of reflection off them, and they're very, very intense. And I hadn't figured a way of doing them flat. I didn't want to just lay them flat on the ground, because Adrian Schiess does that and others. And I had to, in a way, quite literally. The shelves, in a way of a very practical, very simple way of supporting the colour without being the part of the colour, if you like, in a way that the previous work was. I think I've got that wrong. The trolleys were, in a way, another way of doing that, and freeing it from the wall at the same time. And it really was a practical response to a practical problem. And the minute I did one, the first one I did, which was the red one on this side, that was the old trolley I'd found in King's Cross. The minute I did it, I just did a mock-up with a bit of painted cardboard on the top of it. It just somehow began to seem quite interesting. I'm not quite sure why, but I think it's partly to do that the relationship between the surface, the colour, the flat intensity of it, and the very, very knackered, gnarled, slightly smelly old trolley, kind of reproduced that opposition I've been looking for in the earlier work without much apparent effort. But also the trolley was something very emphatic in itself. You always knew what it was. Everyone knows what a trolley is. Actually, they're everywhere. You just don't really look at them very much. And so somehow the colour, although it was absolutely contained by the trolley or contained on it and made exactly to fit it, the two were still somehow quite independent of one another in some other ways. And then I set out on my trolley hunt. I became a kind of hunter-gatherer of trolleys around King's Cross. They're remarkably easy to find and to acquire, especially around the back of McDonald's and Burger King and such like. And most of them are fairly scummy. A lot of them are thrown away. A lot of them are broken or bent and so forth. There's actually a remarkable variety of them. And then you become a kind of a trolley spotter, and then you realise you're going on a bit and such like. But what was very attractive about them in part was that each one, there's no sort of General Motors trolleys. They're all improvised things, just welded together for the particular use that they serve. So they're very rarely do you find any of them very alike. The implication of that being that you can't know before you get it how you're going to make the panel of colour fit it. Some of them, the colour goes over the edges, it sort of bleeds, as it were. Others are contained because they have lips on them. But each one has to be improvised, and that was kind of really quite pleasant, that you couldn't have a studio system, you had to improvise each one as you got it. And some of them, when I did find them in groups, I began to stack them up, because that's what you do with them, those trolleys. They're meant to be stacked up. It also, by stacking them up, it slightly gets rid of that edge of the kind of habitat coffee table that may be an association under the wrong circumstances. And this is the installation of them at the Economist Building. Marble floor as well as marble walls, of course. I had a bit of a problem thinking how I was going to lay them out. When they're in the studio, I'd originally thought of having them a kind of scatter piece, as if they were just sort of been pushed and just landed like bumper cars in the funfair. The minute I did that, it all looked terribly kind of jaunty and fun, or too much like jaunty and fun. And I realised in the end that a better way of doing them was to do them like they're just being parked, like they were waiting to be driven off, like they're in some sort of dumb sort of corporate car park. And it happened to be a kind of long, thin gallery space, so that was a rather convenient way of doing them. So I just lined them up at the back as if they're waiting to be driven off. And in each case, the colour in relationship to the vehicle was fairly randomly decided, or that sometimes I thought if the trolleys had been sprayed, often the trolleys are sprayed a certain colours to indicate who owns them, whether it's Burger King or McDonald's or Express Dairy or whatever. And I thought if they were kind of orange painted, but that I'd do an orange panel because it'd be really kind of cheesy, which it duly was. In other cases, simply to make a very strong contrast between the intrinsic colour of the trolley and the panels of colour. And of course I call them Monochromobiles, for very obvious reasons. And these are just two close-ups. You can see on the one on the far side the degree of reflectiveness you get on that painted Perspex. Perspex painted on the underneath. The one on the near side was a pair I did where, one of the things is once you start looking at them, the engineering of them becomes quite interesting and the way they're actually just held together. I just quite fancy doing one with a translucent piece so you can actually still see the engineering underneath them. The fact that I've actually also been given some sanded Perspex by Marcus Taylor, who used to make those fridges, just meant it was all the more convenient just to slot them in place. But the ones on the near side, the only two I haven't actually painted in those very intense colours. A couple of details just to see the degree of the kind of wretchedness of the vehicles in the first place. They literally do have to be hosed down, most of them, because they are kind of smelly. And of what, you think, yeah. I think the other thing that attracted me to them, apart from the fact that it made these monochromes kind of ludicrous, the monochrome does seem to have become this sort of highly, not just kind of conventional and orthodox kind of work, but it always seems the most serious kind of abstract art somehow. If you can make a monochrome, then you're really working at it. You're really stripping it down and paring it down and really are very, very serious. And incidentally, most monochromes, of course, are black or white or grey. They tend to be tonal rather than brightly coloured. And I think the monochrome was never intended to be that. Or it certainly wasn't intended to be that when it was invented by Rodchenko or when it was used by people like Rauschenberg or Yves Klein or others. I think there was always intended to be a kind of absurdity in it. or a kind of a negative aspect of it. And the point about the monochrome is, yeah, that anyone could make one. Anyone can make a monochrome. And I think that's exactly what's good about them. I mean, of course, anyone can make one of these. There's no skill whatsoever in, or no serious skill whatsoever in making them. And it seems that when the monochrome these days is made, it's done in such a way so as to somehow, rather than negate the traditional skills of fine art, the gesture, the idea of the virtuoso painting, rather than to negate those kinds of elements, the monochromes use actually to exemplify them, to heighten them even. And that simply seems to me to be a less interesting way of working on that subject. I also originally thought I'd better clean up the trolleys, and then I realised that actually they're far less interesting when they're clean than when they're dirty. So, for example, any bits of wire or string that were caught up in the wheels, which is nearly always the case, I make a point of always leaving. And then that's a little pink one that people like for some reason. So it looks vulnerable. Slightly vitamin D deficient kind of thing. I also began to make a series which were literally stacked up against the wall, because that's often how they are left, in buildings and so forth. And I guess the other thing, which this is what it brings me back to what I was saying at the beginning, is that using these old trolleys, as well as using the steel shells, but not in such an obvious way, it begins to reconnect the monochrome to the, if you like, to the everyday life of the city, to the modernity, to the sort of fairly less, the less expensive bits of town and so on, and to fairly ordinary bits of experience. And lastly, I want to show a series of other, a related, a sort of parallel series of work which I've been doing along with the Monochromobiles, which are some found monochromes I've been doing, which are literally those bits of leftover wall that you find, or absent notice boards you find in the towns, or find in London all over the place. And this is one in a triptych from Peckham on the near side, and a monochrome from Elephant Castle on the far side. I just go around simply photographing these found monochromes, as if to suggest that the monochrome, rather than being an invention of art, has been around forever, or since ever there's been cities at least. It's just that we don't notice them. And maybe the value of the monochrome as art is that it draws attention to the monochromes outside of art, or that the monochromes which precede art. And there are a remarkable amount of them lying around. King's Cross is a particularly good site. The one on the far side is the panels which are put up around the back of the British Library. The disused church in Holloway on the near side. A small gate and a wall, obviously. And two I found recently, again around King's Cross. Again, everything I said about monochrome in relationship to the trolleys is, I guess, applicable to these too. And as far as I'm aware, that's it. Yeah, sure, of course.
Just going back a little bit to this relationship between your writing and the studio practice. One thing is quite curious about the progression, development of the work over some years that we've seen, is that thinking about some people that you've written about quite a lot, and art and language you've written quite a lot about, and a lot of relationship with. And there's something very determined about the development from one artwork, one series of artworks to the next in their work, which in some way can be described through a kind of a theoretical investigation, and how their work one set of work relates to another can be talked about
Yeah.
great depth as to why one way is to another. And it's just quite curious, knowing that you are interested quite a lot in their work, seeing your own work, which in some ways you see causal relationship between one to the other because of, I don't know, 6 meter length steel, or because of the castaways from Perspex and the price of Perspex, and a very kind of pragmatic kind of decision making, which is altogether different.
Yes. I mean, I really wanted to stress that point that most of what happens in the studio, a lot of what happens in the studio, in my studio at least, comes out through desperation and accident, studio accidents, happy accidents are the best, the determining force almost. And I think certainly you're right with art and language. There's usually a very highly explained relationship between one series and the next. I hope I wasn't trying to, if you like, overinterpret the relationships between one and the next. I see them as much more casual in my case than theirs. And I think there's a kind of consistency the colour in a way in the last few years has been fairly consistent. It's been what you use as a vehicle for that colour, literally and metaphorically, that's been the issue. So there's been a level of consistency, I think.
Do you ever find yourself in a way kind of almost haunted by your own writing in relation to other artists, not only art and language but others? That kind of like separate.
Only when people ask me questions here about it. I think there's a huge resistance in this country to the idea that you can both make work and write about it. I think it comes from the kind of old art college experiences, and it seems that you're either meant to do it or to comment on it. But I think if you step outside this country, you go to Germany or you go to the States or something, it's just not an issue. I think what's happened to the writing is it's begun more now to follow the studio work, if you like, rather than be independent of it. Obviously, what you're thinking about in the studio is bound to affect what you think about when you're writing, and vice versa. No question about that, and it's a very useful relationship, I think. But I think with the Chromaphobia, certainly, the studio sets the terms much more. And also, if you do reviews for a certain amount of time, it's a bit like being in group shows all the time. There's certain kind of limits to it. And I've run out of things to say about. I don't envy anyone who has to write weekly in a newspaper, to think of something different to say every week. But basically, you think the same things most week, I think. The problem is you can't say the same things most week if you're doing that kind of writing.
There seems to be an aspect of the monochrome that you're displacing. One traditional effect of the monochrome is the oscillation between surface and colour field. So you look at a monochrome painting, and 1 minute you're seeing the paint strokes, and you see it as a kind of thing or an object, and the next minute, you may move back or something and not see those individual strokes, and then you see it as a colour field in which you can sort of lose yourself, or which opens out a idea of some kind of vast space as opposed to the kind of concrete materiality of the object in front of you. Mm-hmm. Now, it seems to me that in using the painted Perspex together with whether it's a found object in the earlier pieces or whether it's the trolley, you're displacing that aspect of materiality or surface away from the colour, so that the colour becomes actually quite etherealized. Do you see what I mean? And I wondered whether you saw it in that way, or whether you thought there were implications to doing that. It's almost like the ambiguity of the monochrome, because the monochrome is a sort of ambiguous thing, not least for that reason, becomes something else.
I'm not quite sure I know how to answer that one, Michael, but one of the attractive characteristics of painting on the back of Perspex is partly that, I mean, one of them is that it doesn't matter how much dust there is in the studio, it never shows up when you paint it. That's a practical reason. But the level of reflection always, as it were, places the monochrome in the world in a way that you always have the contingencies of the environment reflected back at you when you're looking at it, and you can never quite escape that. And in a way, if there's any depth in the work, it's a kind of depth behind you rather than a depth in the painting. You can't lose yourself like you can in like an Anish Kapoor or something. You can't sort of go, or even as Yves Klein tried to suggest, you can't enter the void. If there's any sense of depth in them, the depth's sort of behind you rather than in this sort of virtual space in front of you.
But in a way, a mirror isn't a surface in the way that paint is a surface, painted paint is a surface, and you're turning the sort of painted paint monochrome into a sort of mirror.
Yes.
And then another suggestion that would make to me is a relationship with photography, which equally doesn't have a surface in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, Gerhard Richter sorted all that out sometime before I did. Yeah, sure. I think that's absolutely right. There was a very strong. The relationship between monochrome, mirror, and photography is an extremely interesting one, I think, and one which pretty much was done by, or in some forms, by Richter. Yeah.
But then doesn't colour become detached from matter in a sense?
Well, I think one of the curious things about the Perspex is that you can't. It's not like colour applied to a surface. It doesn't read like that when it's behind the surface. It's almost like colouredness rather than coloured things. It's interesting because I can't, partly because I find it very difficult actually to describe the experience of it.
I just wonder if I can comment this in a slightly similar way, but a bit different. In Thierry Dedeuve's book on Duchamp, called Pictorial Nominalism, he makes a distinction between Kandinsky's sort of way with colour and Duchamp's. That for Kandinsky, colour was a sort of transcendent phenomenon. It was ideally disembodied. Whereas for Duchamp, it was first and foremost pigment. Now, that meant that for Duchamp, for Kandinsky, the problem was always to negotiate a relationship with design, with designer. The problem of form, as he called one of his essays. And what you seem to have done instead is to work through a relationship with the support, where colour must first of all be materialised through pigment, then supported on a surface, and then further supported on a trolley or something, and then finally supported within the institutional frame of the gallery. So that in some kind of way, whenever, with Kandinsky, you're always led back not just to childhood, but to a sort of nascent point when the stuff comes fresh out the tube and there's a kind of incredibly pungent and refulgent point of sort of source, when the colour is the most intense and almost poisonously kind of original. Whereas the effect of a monochrome in a certain way is to, as it were, to spread that, but then to highlight a completely different relationship with the world and with material.
Yes.
No,
I didn't realise that was a question, Brian.
No, but what I'm trying, I mean, at the beginning you were really talking about attitudes to colour.
Yeah.
And as you work through your description of your own work, it was becoming more and more apparent that in some sense the theme of the work was the problem of the support.
I think that's right. I mean, that probably is right. I hadn't organised it in my mind in exactly that way, but clearly the support does become a critical issue. Particularly if you stop using the things like oil paints, where in a way the expectation is that the support is a given, and kind of invisible in a way as well.
Well, I mean, there are lots of other nice. I mean, the thing with Duchamp, when he said about the dust, in some kind of way, you're doing something like dust, something like Duchamp. In another way, you're taking a different attitude. I mean, Duchamp actually gathered the dust on his surface and so on.
There's someone in the back who's going to ask.
I've got a point that comes out of the last two, which kind of relates to looking at your work as photographs this evening. And I've got a sneaking suspicion that the history of the monochrome, in terms of art history, is very much dependent on, or has a very close relation to the history of art publications. And that, I mean, as Rodchenko, that you mentioned, drops painting altogether to move into productivism, that happens to be also a move into black and white, simply because printed matter was black and white at the time. I wonder if colour, had colour reproduction been around, I wonder what Rodchenko would have done. Then, when there's a real boom in art publishing, sort of post-war, it's absolutely perfect climate for the American sort of high modernist monochrome. But what's interesting about your work in relation to what Michael said earlier was, because it has this high gloss, and what we've seen tonight has obviously been quite carefully photographed. I wonder how you could relate either the similarities or the differences between seeing your work, say at the Economist Building, and seeing it on slide.
Well, it's better seeing it in the flesh. I mean, I tell you why. It's a very simple reason, which is as you move around it, the reflections change, and it is, kind of dynamic. I mean, you're right, of course, that the relationship between photography and colour reproduction and distribution of through magazines and such like is absolutely critical to the development of art in the later part of the 20th century. However, I'm not so sure the monochromes, the thing that's done well out of that. Ad Reinhardt said his work, the reason why he was never as famous as anyone else was that his work couldn't be photographed, which is true.
But that's probably also the reason why there's an awful lot of interest in him now, and also in, say, Ryman, because now their work looks absolutely fantastic in catalogues, because it can, it can cope. And they're obviously photographed incredibly well. Probably more Ryman, because there is this quite traditional
Reinhardt's
emphasis on facture.
It's very hard to see what you see in a Reinhardt in any kind of photograph, because the variations are so close. I mean, my stuff photographs okay, and I've benefited from that, sure. I mean, because when designers see it, they think, oh yeah, okay, that'll be a good page in a magazine, so we'll use his work. Fine. I think the work, in a way that, the way I've used your argument about photography and the relationship and distribution is, to my mind, I think some of the most photogenic work is certainly the most widely distributed. But that's often with the kind of the work based around mannequins. Jeff Koons, the Chapmans, Damien Hirst, in a way. I mean, their work doesn't suffer greatly through reproduction. On the contrary, sometimes reproduction enhances it. And I think that's not that the interest in that range of mannequin-based work, dummy art, I think it has to be discussed in relationship to the possibilities of photography. And I don't speak as someone who's innocent of that by any means, as you suggest.
I just sense that what your work might lose in, that loss of the moving, mobile reflection, the work actually gains by having such a sympathy with photographic, glossy reproduction. There's a kind of parity there.
Yeah, okay. Sure. I don't know. They are physical things, though. I mean, you mustn't. Yeah, of course, we see probably 95% of the art we see in slide form or in form of colour reproductions in magazines. But they are physical things. I mean, they are emphatically physical, I think. As is the experience of the shelf-based works. They're kind of quite chunky and thick, and they're not, in that sense, they're not images, but they do convert to images relatively well. I agree, but I don't think you can make that. I don't think you could cut out the middleman, as it were, and just make them to be photographed, if you like. I think that would be to lose something very substantial from them. Well, I've got a question. No. No, I haven't.